This family can't afford to keep everyone. My stepmother said those words as she pushed a marriage contract across the table toward me, as if she were cutting a redundant business expense, not deciding the fate of a human being. The third-floor conference room was so cold, my fingertips were numb. An old air conditioner hummed incessantly from the ceiling. The cup of coffee in front of me had long gone cold, but no one bothered to touch it. Just like how no one really looked at me as this decision was being made. The Calloway Corporation will save your father's company from bankruptcy. Vivian continued, her voice frighteningly calm. In return, they want a private marriage. I didn't ask who I had to marry. I knew instantly I was the one being traded away. Not Amelia, her biological daughter, the one always brought to fundraising goals with Chicago's elite. Not the daughter whose arm she so proudly took in front of the press. The most disposable person in this house has always been me, a man I had never met. A marriage signed like a business deal to save the company. And the thing that chilled me to the bone wasn't any of that. It was the fact that no one in this room felt it was wrong. The black SUV carried me away from downtown Chicago as it neared 9 o'clock at night. The snow began to fall heavier along Lakeshore Drive, the yellow streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement, creating long streaks of light that seemed to melt beneath the tires. The driver said almost nothing the entire way. He only asked if I was cold when he saw me unconsciously clutch my old coat tighter. Then he went back to driving in silence. I sat in the back seat, watching the city shrink behind the glass. My phone buzzed twice. One text was from my father, asking how the meeting with the bank went. The other was from Vivian, containing just a single sentence. Don't embarrass the family. I turned off my phone's screen. 30 minutes later, the car turned into the northern suburbs, where mansions sat separated by vast lawns, and perfectly manicured, leafless trees lined the entrances. I had passed through this area a few times as a child with my father for his year-end business parties. Back then, I used to think the people in these houses must be so happy because their homes were beautiful enough to be in the movies. I stopped thinking that a long time ago. The iron gates of the Calloway estate opened slowly with the nearly silent hum of an electric motor. The car proceeded down a long driveway covered in white gravel, flanked on both sides by low garden lights that cast a pale yellow glow onto the cold snow. The mansion that came into view was larger than I had imagined. Classic old money architecture with gray stone walls and tall windows that stretched from the first floor all the way to the second. It was beautiful to the point of feeling cold. There was no music, no voices, no sign at all that a real family actually lived here together. The driver stepped out to open my door. Welcome to the Calloway residence, Miss Claire. I started to ask where my husband was, but I stopped myself. Even the word husband still sounded so foreign in my head. The front door opened before I could even touch the bell. An older woman in a housekeeper's uniform was waiting just inside. She had silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and the perfectly polite smile of someone who had served wealthy families for many years. I am Margaret, she said. Your room has been prepared. No one said welcome home. The strange thing was, I realized I had been hoping to hear those words, even just once. I stepped inside, and the first thing I felt was the silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a house late at night. It was a distant, detached silence, as if every sound here was deliberately hushed so as not to disturb something unseen. My footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floor as Margaret led me through the grand foyer. Everything was unbelievably perfect. Old oil paintings hung precisely on the walls. The white flowers in the vase were fresh. Not a single speck of dust, not a single object out of place. But I felt no warmth. A real home always has traces of the people who live inside it. A jacket forgotten on the sofa. A glass that hasn't been taken to the kitchen yet. The faint sound of a TV still on somewhere. The echo of laughter down the hall. There was nothing like that here. It all felt more like a luxury hotel than a place someone comes home to after a long day. Margaret led me past the formal dining room, and I subconsciously slowed my steps. A long table, set for 12, was draped in a perfect white tablecloth beneath a crystal chandelier. The silverware cast cold reflections of light on its surface. Not a single chair was pulled out. There was no indication that this room had ever been used for an actual family dinner. "Mr. Ethan is still working tonight," Margaret said, as if she could read my thoughts. It was the first time I had heard his name mentioned since signing the marriage license. "Does he often work late?" "Very late." She didn't say anything else. I was led to the second floor, down a hallway so long that my footsteps echoed as if I were in an old hotel. The room intended for me was nearly the size of the entire apartment I rented in college. There was a king-size bed with cream-colored sheets. A large glass door looked out onto the snow-covered garden behind the mansion. On the sofa by the window, several sets of new clothes had already been laid out, prepared in my exact measurements. Everything was so meticulously prepared. And that very fact made me feel more like a package that had just been delivered than a person who was starting a new life. "I'll leave you to rest," Margaret said softly before she left. "Model." The door closed. I stood alone in the middle of the vast room, listening to the winter wind tap softly against the thick glass outside. In that moment, I realized I knew nothing about the man I had just married. I didn't know what he liked to eat. I didn't know what his laugh sounded like. I didn't know how his voice sounded when he was angry. I had never even seen his face. I sat down on the edge of the bed, taking off the high heels that had made my feet ache all day. The room remained uncomfortably silent. Then I noticed the only thing still lit in this entire mansion, the light from downstairs. I stepped out into the hallway again, near midnight, following a faint, yellow trail of light that stretched from the bottom of the staircase to the first floor. The lights in the spacious kitchen were still on. The soft hum of a coffee machine echoed in the stillness. I hadn't seen the man yet. But for the first time since stepping into this house, I started to feel curious. Why would someone living in such a be unable to sleep every night? I met Ethan Calloway for the first time the next morning in a kitchen larger than the first apartment I'd ever rented when I started working. It was just after 6 a.m. The sky outside was still dark, and snow blanketed the garden behind the large floor-to-ceiling glass. I had barely slept all night, unused to the new room and the overwhelming silence of the house. Near dawn, I gave up, changed into a sweater, and went downstairs to find some coffee. The sound of the coffee machine reached me before I had fully stepped into the kitchen. A man was standing with his back to me. He was tall with broad shoulders, wearing a dark gray dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. One hand rested on the stone countertop, the other held a black espresso cup. There was something very orderly about the air around him. The kind of person who could make others automatically lower their voices just by standing still. He turned at the sound of my footsteps. That was the first time I saw Ethan Calloway. He wasn't the type of man you'd see on the cover of a business magazine with a perfect smile and a fake glint in his eye. Ethan's demeanor was too composed to be friendly. His face was angular, his eyes cold but not emotionless. They were the eyes of someone who was used to observing others before deciding whether or not to trust them. He looked at me for a few seconds. No smile, no greeting, just. His voice was deep and very calm. "No," I replied. "I couldn't sleep anyway." He gave a slight nod, as if that piece of information wasn't very important. "Coffee's in the left cabinet." Then he turned back to the open laptop on the kitchen island. That was the first strange thing about Ethan. He wasn't rude. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to be intimidating. But the distance he created was so palpable that I felt like I was standing in a stranger's house, not my husband's. I took a mug from the cabinet, made myself some coffee, and stood facing the glass wall, watching the snow fall in the garden. The entire kitchen was filled with a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but deeply distant. Margaret said, "You used to work at Bennett Logistics." I turned back to look at him. That's right. Financial compliance? Yes. He typed a few lines as laptop before continuing. "Have you quit yet?" "I haven't thought about it." "You should think about it soon." The way he spoke was strange. It wasn't an order. It was just like someone who was used to controlling everything around him and wanted to know exactly what would happen next. "I don't plan on depending on your family," I said. For the first time, Ethan looked up and held my gaze for longer than a few seconds. "I'm not saying you have to be dependent, but you think I will, eventually." He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. I understand people like Ethan. People who've been betrayed don't listen to what others say. They just watch what they do. He glanced at the old phone in my hand as I checked the time, his brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. "Is your phone broken?" "Why do you ask?" "It's an old model. It still works. The Calloway family isn't short on money for a new phone, but I don't need one." A short silence fell between us. I saw it in Ethan's eyes for the first time. Not annoyance, but suspicion. He was trying to figure out if I was for real or just putting on an act. The days that followed passed in the strangest version of what you could call a marriage. Ethan was almost always home, but he kept just enough distance to make me feel like a guest. He didn't control me in an authoritarian way. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't look at my phone. He didn't impose any rules. But he watched everything. When I wore my old coat instead of ordering a new one. When I refused the black card Margaret brought to my room. When I drove my own old Honda to the grocery store instead of using one of the Calloway cars. One evening, I was working on my laptop in the second-floor library when Ethan walked in. He glanced at my screen for a few seconds. "What are you working on?" "A remote audit for a shipping company in Milwaukee." "At 11 o'clock at night?" "I like working at night. You don't need the money. Everyone needs money. I can set up a monthly transfer for you." "I know." "Then why are you still doing it?" I looked up at him. "Because I don't want to have to ask for anything." Something in Ethan's eyes shifted after I said that. I couldn't tell exactly what I saw in his eyes just then. Maybe it was surprise, maybe something that looked a lot like respect. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You wouldn't have to ask. That's not how it works." He fell silent. I knew I was right. Money isn't always used to buy people. It's used to make them feel indebted. And when someone feels indebted to you for long enough, they start to think they no longer have the right to leave. I'd seen it my whole life in the Bennett family. I'm not going to live like that again. A week later, Ethan left a small box on the kitchen table in front of me. "I think you'll need this." Inside was the latest iPhone. I looked at it for a few seconds, then closed the lid. "Thank you," I said, "but my phone is fine." "Claire, I'm serious. You don't have to prove anything." "No," I replied softly. "I just don't want to feel like everything around me has a price." This time, Ethan didn't say anything more. But that night, when I came down to the kitchen for water around 1 in the morning, the box was gone from the table. Not everyone in the house made me as tense as Ethan did. Margaret started talking to me more after a few days. The head chef, Daniel, had diabetes but was hiding it from the Calloway family so he could keep working. I found out when I saw him secretly injecting insulin in the pantry. From the next day on, I quietly adjusted the breakfast menu. Less sugar, more lighter options. Daniel noticed immediately but didn't ask anything. He just looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "Thank you, Claire." I started to remember the name of every staff member. The gardener loved old jazz. The girl in charge of laundry was taking night classes at the university. The private driver had chronic back pain whenever it got cold. Those little things made this house feel a little less like a museum. One evening, Ethan came home close to 2 in the morning after a meeting in downtown Chicago. I was sitting in the living room reading some documents when I heard the door open. He paused when he saw the light was still on. "Why aren't you asleep yet?" "I thought you might need an aspirin." I pointed to the box of pills and a glass of water I'd set on the table. "The driver mentioned you had a meeting with the investment board today." Ethan looked at the box of pills for a few seconds. "You don't have to stay up waiting for me." I wasn't waiting up. I was a terrible liar. The corner of his mouth twitched, as if he was about to smile, but then he didn't. That was the first time I realized Ethan wasn't as cold as I thought. He was just too used to shouldering everything on his own. A few days later, I was walking past Ethan's study and heard another man's voice inside. "I'm being serious," the other person said. "What if she really doesn't need the money?" I froze instinctively. It must have been Luis, the only friend I'd seen Ethan meet with privately since I arrived. There was silence from inside for a few seconds. Then, Ethan answered very quietly. "No one comes into another person's life without wanting something. I think the problem is that you're always begging for people to leave before they've even had a real chance to stay." There was no immediate reply. Standing there in the hallway, I suddenly realized the saddest thing about Ethan Calloway wasn't that he didn't trust others. It was more that perhaps he had lived for so long with the feeling that sooner or later he would be abandoned. I started to realize something was wrong around 8 p.m. The house was unusually quiet that day, the kind of silence that made even the longtime staff speak in softer voices. Margaret dropped a spoon in the kitchen and flinched, as if she'd just made a huge mistake. Daniel had finished cooking dinner early, but no one came to the dining table. Even the lights in the house were dimmed lower than usual. I was in the library checking a freelance financial report when Luis called. "Claire." His voice was low the moment I picked up. "Is Ethan home yet?" "No." "Is something wrong?" Luis was silent for a few seconds. "Today is the day his mother left." I didn't know what to say. "I thought he'd be better this year," Luis continued, "but Ethan has never truly been okay on this day." "Where is he?" "Probably at the old whiskey bar near the Chicago River, the place he goes to every year." 40 minutes later, I found Ethan in a small bar at the end of a street near Fulton Market. He was sitting alone in the farthest corner, his coat still dusted with a few half-melted snowflakes on the shoulders. The bar wasn't crowded. The sound of old jazz music played softly in the dark space that smelled of wood and whiskey. The bartender looked at me as I walked in, then gave a subtle nod toward Ethan, as if he already knew who I was there to find. I had never seen Ethan like this, not drunk in a way that he'd lost control. He just looked tired. So tired that the arms he always kept so tightly around himself seemed to crack just a little. In front of him was his, I don't know how many glass of whiskey. Ethan was resting his elbow on the bar, his eyes looking down at the countertop, as if trying to focus on some old thought that even he himself had grown tired of. He looked up when I pulled up the chair next to him. "Claire?" His voice was huskier than usual. "I thought you didn't drink." "I thought so too." He let out a faint, bitter smile before looking back down at his glass. I didn't ask any more questions. That's something I learned after years of living with people who hide their emotions. Sometimes, people don't need someone to fix them. They just need someone who won't walk away the moment they see the worst parts of them. We sat in silence like that for nearly 10 minutes. Outside the glass window, snow was still falling heavily on the brightly lit streets of Chicago. "Did Luis call you?" "Yes," Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm going to fire him." "I thought you'd hug him first." The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched slightly, then quickly disappeared. That was the strange thing about Ethan. Even at his most exhausted, He still tried to look like he was okay. Like someone who has lived for too long with the thought that if you break down in front of someone, they will only use it to hurt you again. I reached out and took the glass from in front of him. That's enough. Do you always like to give orders? Only when the other person is acting foolishly. This time, Ethan actually let out a small laugh. It was a very short sound, but it was the first laugh I had heard from him since I first stepped into that house. I took him home around 11 p.m. Snow covered the driveway in front of the Calloway mansion. Ethan got out of the car a little slower than usual, but still tried to look composed. He hates letting others see him when he's vulnerable. I realized that a long time ago. He took off his own coat, walked into the kitchen, and then slid down to the floor, his back against the cabinets, as if his body finally lacked the strength to keep pretending. I stood a few steps away. The warm kitchen light fell on his face, and in that moment, Ethan no longer looked like the man who controlled everything in multi-million-dollar meetings. He just looked like an overgrown boy, trying to convince himself that he was okay. I was 9, he said unexpectedly. I didn't interrupt. My mother said she was going on a business trip for 3 days. He laughed dryly. She even kissed my hair before she left. Ethan's voice began to break. I sat at the living room window for those entire 3 days. He looked down at the kitchen floor. On the 4th day, my father received the divorce papers. I felt my chest tighten. She moved to New York with another man, a real estate billionaire. Ethan gave another faint, bitter smile. The papers called it the high society romance of the year. The kitchen was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I thought maybe I wasn't good enough for her to stay. Ethan said that line so softly. So softly, it was as if he hadn't meant for me to hear it, but had accidentally let it escape after holding it in for so many years. And I understood the most heartbreaking thing. A lot of adults are really just trying to live alongside the most wounded version of their childhood selves. They grow up. They make money. They learn how to run a company. They become so strong that everyone thinks they don't need anyone anymore. But deep down, there's still that child who stood by the window, waiting for someone who would never return. Ethan covered his eyes with his hand for a few seconds, then exhaled sharply. I hate the feeling of needing someone because you think they'll leave eventually. He didn't answer, which meant I was right. I watched my mother love a man for 12 years, then leave him just because someone richer came along, Ethan said slowly. After that, what do you expect me to believe in, Claire? I don't know. It was the only honest answer I had. I didn't sit down beside him like in a romantic movie. I didn't hug him. I didn't offer perfect healing words. I just got a glass of water, set it down near him, and then sat in the chair across from him, staying. That's all. Without judgment, without trying to fix him, without forcing him to be strong again right away. Around midnight, Ethan leaned his head back against the cabinets and looked up at the ceiling. Have you ever stayed with someone just because you wanted to stay? I looked at him for a few seconds. Yes. And they left anyway? Yeah. Ethan nodded slightly, as if for the first time someone had told him a truth he could understand. No one is immune to damage. We just learn how to carry it. He closed his eyes then, his voice growing quieter. I don't want to become my father. You're not like him. How would you know? Because you're still afraid of hurting people. The kitchen fell silent. Outside the glass door, snow continued to fall on the pale dark garden behind the house. I sat there for almost another hour in the soft yellow light of the vast kitchen, watching the man who always controlled everything finally allow himself to be tired for once. And strangely, that was the first moment Edith Calloway started to feel truly close to me. Everything came undone on a Friday night during a birthday party for one of Ethan's friends in downtown Chicago. I had almost refused to go. After that night in the kitchen, Things between Ethan and me began to change in a way that was hard to name. He was still quiet, still instinctively kept his distance. But the coldness from before had lost its sharp edge. Ethan started asking if I'd had dinner when he got home late. He started remembering what kind of tea I liked. One time, I fell asleep on the sofa while working, and when I woke up, there was a thick blanket draped over me. Little things like that are more dangerous than any kind of flirtation. They make your heart soften when you're not even realizing it. Maybe that's why I agreed to go with him that night. The black dress Margaret had prepared for me was simpler than I'd expected, not too flashy. Just enough to make me feel like I belonged there, at least a little. Ethan was waiting in the foyer when I came down the stairs. He looked up at me and was silent for a few seconds. "Does this not look okay?" I asked. "No." Ethan adjusted the cuff of his shirt as if to hide his reaction. "It's more than okay." That was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever received from him. The party was held on the top floor of a hotel overlooking the Chicago River. Live jazz played softly from the end of the hall, the warm lights reflecting off champagne flutes and the expensive suits of the city's wealthy elite. I quickly realized Ethan wasn't like most of the men here. He didn't try to draw attention to himself. He didn't laugh too much. He didn't touch people more than necessary. But everyone automatically made way for him when he walked past. That kind of respect didn't come from money. It came from the fact that Ethan was a man who always kept his word. Claire. A man's voice from behind made me turn around. The man in front of me was in his 40s, wearing a platinum wedding band, and standing near a blonde woman and 2 children who were laughing by the dessert table at the end of the hall. He looked at me for a few seconds, then let out a surprised laugh. Finally, we meet in person. Before I could understand what was happening, Ethan stepped forward very quickly. Hands. His voice dropped low. "Oh, hell," the other man said, looking back and forth between me and Ethan as if he'd just realized something. "Wait a minute, she doesn't know?" I turned to Ethan. His entire body had gone rigid. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw Ethan Calloway truly panic. An icy chill ran down my spine. "No what?" No one answered right away. The woman next to Hans gently pulled her husband's arm, as if trying to stop him from speaking, but it was too late. "I thought you knew Ethan was the one on the marriage certificate." Every sound around me seemed to disappear. The music, the clinking of glasses, the sound of people talking. Everything suddenly felt so far away. I looked at Ethan. "What does he mean?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Claire, don't say my name like that right now." My voice trembled, even though I was trying to stay calm. "The man I married, wasn't it your brother?" No, just one word. But it was enough to make everything inside my head come crashing down. "From the very beginning," I said very quietly. "The person on the marriage certificate was you?" Ethan didn't deny it. I took a step back instinctively. It wasn't out of anger at some movie-like plot twist. It was because of another feeling, one that was much more painful. Humiliation. I remembered everything, the times he observed me, the moments he tested my reactions to money, the seemingly casual questions, the credit card, the phone, his judging gaze every time I refused to accept something from him. I was never really seen as a person. I was a test, a project to evaluate greed. A woman placed in an emotional laboratory without her even knowing it. Claire. Ethan stepped closer. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" I let out a small, bitter laugh, but my throat ached. "That you needed to make sure I wasn't the same type of woman as your mother before you could treat me with kindness." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" Ethan looked at me but couldn't answer right away. Because for the first time, he no longer had a reasonable answer for his actions. I felt my eyes growing hot, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "I thought you were the first person in that house who was starting to see me as a real person." "Claire, but it turns out you were just watching to see if I would pass your test. People around us were starting to notice something was wrong. Hans gently pulled his wife away, leaving us a private space in the corner of the balcony overlooking the brightly lit river below. Light snow began to fall outside. Ethan stepped closer again, but this time I stepped back. I know I was wrong. No, I shook my head. The worst part is that you didn't think you were wrong when you started doing this. Those words hit Ethan hard. I saw it on his face. For the first time, that perfect layer of control around him truly cracked. I thought that if someone came for money, he said slowly, then sooner or later she would show her true colors. And if I didn't pass? Ethan was silent. I would have just become more proof that all women are the same, right? Claire, listen to me. No. I looked straight at him. You listen to me. I took a deep breath, but my voice still caught in my throat. Someone who's been abandoned often thinks everyone will leave. I understand that, I said very slowly. But do you know what the most terrifying part is? Ethan stood perfectly still. It's when someone who has done nothing wrong has to pay for someone else's mistakes. Ethan's whole expression froze, as if he'd just been struck. And for the first time since I'd known him, I thought Ethan finally truly understood what he had done. He wasn't protecting himself. He was punishing someone else for his own past pain. I continued, my voice growing quieter. I never asked to be in your life, Ethan, and I'm not the one who caused your mother to leave. I looked at him. But you treated me as if I was responsible for it. No. Yes, you did. I didn't cry. That probably hurt Ethan even more. I thought if I was kind enough, patient enough, understanding enough, you would eventually trust me. I let out a bitter laugh. But it turns out, from the very beginning, I was put on trial without even knowing I was being judged. A cold wind from the river blew across the balcony. Ethan ran a hand harshly over his face, like a man waking up after years of living in the same fear. I never wanted to hurt you. It doesn't have to be intentional to cause pain. A long silence fell between us. Then Ethan said what was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said since I met him. I don't know how to trust someone without preparing for them to leave me. For the first time that evening, I felt a pang of sympathy for him again. And that just made me sadder, because so many good people out there end up hurting others, not because they're bad, but because they've never healed their own wounds. Trauma is like something passed from one person to another. If no one is aware enough to stop it, it will continue to make innocent people pay the price for wounds they didn't create. Ethan looked at me for a long time. I don't want to lose you. That was practically his first real confession. My heart ached. Because the saddest part is, I know he was telling the truth. But sometimes a person who genuinely loves you can still hurt you deeply. I didn't speak to Ethan for almost 3 days after that party. It wasn't the dramatic, throwing things and sobbing kind of anger you see in movies. I just became polite to the point of being distant. I ate breakfast after he'd already left the house, worked in the library instead of the living room, answered every question with the shortest possible response, and Ethan accepted it. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side of that distance. The strange thing was, Ethan didn't try to act He didn't follow me around the house with long speeches about his traumatic childhood. He didn't try to play the victim to make me soften up. He just started to change, in very small ways, and that was what made it so hard for me to keep my guard up. On Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of people talking on the first floor. When I walked down to the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. The entire old staff was back. Daniel was arguing with the food supplier about the wrong type of salmon. Margaret gave me a small smile the moment she saw me. The sound of a vacuum cleaner hummed down the hall. For the first time since I'd arrived, the house was filled with the sound of life. Ethan was standing by the kitchen counter, reading emails on his iPad. He looked up at me. I figured a person shouldn't have to live in their own homes and let guests. That was all he said. No asking for forgiveness. No trying to score points. But I understood what he was saying. He had seen how lonely I was from the beginning. He was just too busy being defensive to admit it. That afternoon, I came back to my room after a call with my father and noticed something was different. The room had been changed. It no longer had the cold, perfect colors of a high-end hotel room. The reading chair I'd stopped to look at for so long in a furniture store last week was now by the window. A small oak bookshelf was placed against the wall. Even the warm, yellow reading lamp I'd once said, "Looks more like home," was there next to the sofa. I stood in the middle of the room for a few seconds. Ethan didn't know that I recognized all those details. Or maybe he did. That evening, I found him in the library. "Why did you do it?" Ethan closed his laptop. "I heard you say you didn't like the room feeling like a hotel." It was the first time he'd ever addressed me so tenderly. It sounded so natural, as if he himself didn't even realize he'd done it. I looked at him for a few seconds, but I didn't know how to respond. The hardest part isn't forgiving someone. It's when they actually start to change, and you realize you still want to believe in them. 2 days later, Vivian showed up at the Calloway estate. I was just coming down the stairs when I heard her voice ringing through the living room. "She's your wife now. It's only normal to support her family." I knew immediately she was here for money. Vivian was dressed impeccably as always, a diamond bracelet on her wrist, so bright it was dazzling. But I noticed the tension in her eyes the moment Ethan walked into the room. He was wearing a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his expression so calm it was cold. "I believe we made the final transfer last month," Ethan said. Vivian forced a quick smile. "That's true, but the situation at Bennett Logistics isn't entirely stable yet. I've seen the financial reports." Ethan sat down across from her. "The company has no more bad debt." Vivian's smile tightened slightly. "Families should help each other." "Family," Ethan repeated slowly, as if weighing the word. "Is that why you forced Claire into this marriage?" I saw Vivian's hand tighten its grip on the strap of her purse. "You don't understand our family's internal affairs." "No." Ethan looked her straight in the eye. "I understand perfectly. No one raised their voice. No one insulted anyone. But for the first time in my life, I saw that Vivian had lost control of the situation." Ethan opened a desk drawer, took out a cream-colored envelope, and placed it in front of her. "This contains confirmation of the financial support for Bennett Logistics." His voice was still perfectly polite. "After today, all financial ties between our two families will be terminated." Vivian stared at him. "Claire is my husband's daughter, and you used that to make her feel she had to trade away her own self-worth just to be accepted." The room fell silent. I had never had anyone stand up for me like that before. It wasn't the loud kind of protection meant to be a show of masculine strength. No pounding on the table, no threats. It was simply that for the first time, someone saw my actions as something worthy of respect. Vivian left 10 minutes later, her face tight with anger. When the door closed, Ethan turned to me. "Are you okay?" I nodded reflexively, then was surprised to feel tears welling up in my eyes. Not because I was sad, but because I was tired. Tired from a lifetime of having to protect myself, all alone. Ethan stepped closer, but still kept enough distance so that I wouldn't feel pressured. "Claire," his voice was low. "I don't want you to have to fight alone anymore." I looked at him for a long time. Then, for the first time since the party, I asked the question that was really on my mind. "Why are you only doing this now?" Ethan was silent for a few seconds. "Because before, I thought keeping my distance would keep me safe." He gave a soft, wry smile. "But it turns out distance doesn't protect anyone." That night, Ethan knocked on my bedroom door. He was holding a small, silver key. "There's a records room in the east basement," he said. "The access code is my father's birthday. I looked at the key in his hand, not understanding. Inside are all the family's financial records, trust funds, assets, investment contracts. Ethan held the key out to me. Only my father and I have ever had access before. I didn't take it right away. Ethan, I'm not giving this to you for the money. His voice was calm, but this time, his gaze didn't waver at all. I'm giving this to you because I want you to know. I don't see you as an outsider anymore. I felt a lump form in my throat because I finally understood that what I truly needed from the very beginning was never the money or the luxurious life in this mansion. It was the feeling of being chosen, of being trusted, of being seen as someone valuable, even when I didn't have to prove a thing. Some people say love is the most precious thing in the world. I used to think so. That is, until I saw Ethan give me that key, his hands trembling slightly, as if he were handing over the most difficult lesson he'd ever learned. Trust. And sometimes trust is more valuable than love. Things between Ethan and me didn't change like they do in the movies. There was no sudden moment where we realized we were in love and rushed into each other's arms for a kiss in the snow. There were no long, emotional confessions or grand gestures meant to catch the world's attention. It changed very slow, so slowly, that most of the time, I only noticed after things were already different. It was like a cold room slowly warming up, and the person inside only realizes it when they no longer need to pull the blankets so tightly around themselves. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan asked if I wanted to act out with him. Where are we going? To buy a few things. A few things turned out to be almost 3 hours at a furniture store out in Northbrook. I never would have pegged Ethan as the type of man to stand seriously between two nearly identical couches and debate with a designer for a full 20 minutes. This one is grayer. No, I said. This one is just sadder. Ethan turned to look at me. Did you just judge a paint color based on emotion? Of course. I crossed my arms, looking at the two swatches in front of us. A person lives in a home, not a catalog. The corner of his mouth twitched up ever so slightly. Since when did you start talking like a 40-year-old housewife? Since you made me live in a house that looks like a divorce lawyer's office. The employee standing next to us was trying so hard not to laugh. His face turned red. The strange thing was, Ethan wasn't annoyed. He was starting to enjoy it when I challenged. I realized it in that moment as he leaned against the checkout counter watching me debate with an employee about why a cream-colored sofa would look better than a gray one in the sitting room. It wasn't because he cared about the sofa. It was because he liked the feeling of having someone actually living in that house, instead of just passing through it. In the end, we bought a lot more than we'd planned. A new reading chair, 2 table lamps, a low wooden shelf to put by the window, and a pile of decorative pillows that Ethan called meaningless, overpriced lumps of fabric. And yet, you still bought them. I married someone who can spend 15 minutes picking out the color of a pillow. Ethan lifted the shopping bags. Clearly, I've already accepted my defeat. I laughed, for the first time freely and comfortably since this marriage began. The sound made Ethan pause for a few seconds, as if he still wasn't used to being the one who made me laugh. That night, on the way home, a light sleet started to fall. We stopped at a small, 24-hour burger joint near the highway because we were both too tired to go home and cook. Ethan, in a simple black coat, sat in the car eating a burger near midnight, looking like a regular man instead of the CEO of a luxury hotel chain the Chicago press was always talking about. I watched him take a bite of his burger, then frown. What? You eat the pickles first? So? I've never seen anyone do that. Ethan glanced down at the burger in his hands for a few seconds. Maybe it's because I'm a psychopath. I burst out laughing so hard I almost spilled my fries. The sleet tapped softly against the car windows. Outside, there was the distant glow of a gas station and the nearly empty roads of midnight. That moment was so simple, There was nothing special about it, and maybe that's why it felt so real. Mature love isn't always like the final scene of a movie. Sometimes it's just sitting in a car, eating a burger with someone who makes you feel less alone. In the weeks that followed, Ethan started coming home earlier. No one said it out loud, but everyone in the house noticed. Margaret once smiled at me when she saw Ethan sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee at 7 in the evening instead of still being at the office like he usually was. Daniel started cooking more dishes because Mr. Ethan is finally willing to eat dinner on time. Even the house itself began to change. There was soft music in the kitchen, the smell of baked goods on the weekends. Glasses left on the living room table because someone had fallen asleep while watching a movie. For the first time since I'd arrived, the Calloway mansion started to feel like a home. One night, I fell asleep on the sofa in the library. My laptop was still open on my lap, an Excel spreadsheet left half finished. I remember Ethan had been reading documents at the desk across from me while I was trying to finish a freelance report before its deadline. When I woke up, the room was bathed in a very soft yellow light. The laptop had been closed. A blanket was draped over me. Ethan was sitting near the window, his glasses perched low on his nose, still reading documents under the light of a desk lamp. I watched him for a few seconds before speaking softly. "What time is it?" "Almost 1 in the morning. You could have woken me up. You were sleeping so peacefully." His voice was very quiet. I sat up, pulling the blanket around my shoulders. "What about you?" Ethan was silent for a few seconds, then closed the folder he was reading. "I like it better like this." "Like what?" "When there's someone in the house." I felt my heart tighten slightly. It wasn't because the words were particularly romantic. It was because they were real. I looked at the man in front of me for a long time before I realized the biggest change in Ethan wasn't that he'd become gentler. It was that he'd stopped living as if he were always preparing to be left behind. He started leaving his personal things outside of his office. He started getting more sleep. He started telling me the little things about his day that he used to keep to himself. One time, Ethan came home looking exhausted after a meeting with the investment board in Manhattan. "Was it that bad?" I asked. "I just had to listen to 3 men over 60 argue for 2 hours about the logo color for a new hotel." I tried to hold back a laugh. "That sounds awful. I'm starting to think money can't buy maturity." I handed him a cup of hot tea and sat down on the sofa next to him. Ethan looked at me for a few seconds. I used to think love was something that made people weak. And now? He leaned back against the couch, his gaze softening very slowly. "With you, I don't have to be on guard anymore." That sentence stayed in my head for a long time after that night, because I finally understood what mature love really is. It's not about someone coming to save your life. It's not about grand gestures. It's the feeling of your body finally letting go of its tension when you're with someone. It's like, after so many years, you no longer have to brace yourself for being hurt. And perhaps that is the rarest kind of peace in the world. Ethan proposed to me on an early spring evening, just after the snow in Chicago had completely melted from the trees in front of our house. There was no fancy restaurant, no hundreds of candles, no violin music, or a hidden lake somewhere like in those proposal videos online. I was sitting on the floor of the spare living room, surrounded by a pile of furniture, catalogs, and curtain fabric samples that we still hadn't agreed on a final color for. Ethan walked in with 2 cups of hot tea and sat down next to me. "I think this color is nicer." He handed me a light cream-colored fabric sample. "Since when did you start caring about curtains?" Since you turned me into the kind of man who has an opinion on curtains." I laughed and leaned my head back against the sofa behind me. "Did you know that when I first came here, I thought I wouldn't be able to stand this house?" Ethan looked at me for a long moment. "I know. Then why didn't you stop everything sooner?" He was silent for a few seconds, then put his tea down. Because I've spent so long living with the feeling of always having to be ready to be abandoned, he said, his voice very quiet. Until you walked into my house and made it start to feel like a real home. Before I could say anything, Ethan took a small black velvet box from his pocket. It wasn't one of those giant diamond rings you show off to the whole world. It was just a simple, elegant ring, exactly Ethan's style. He looked at me. For the first time since we'd met, I saw that this man was truly nervous. Claire. He breathed out very slowly. I know things started the wrong way. I didn't interrupt. The first time you walked into my house, you thought you were being traded to save a company. Ethan gave a soft, bitter laugh, but his eyes softened right after. I just want you to live the rest of your life without ever feeling like you have to trade something to be allowed to stay. I immediately felt my eyes burn. It wasn't because of the ring. It was because someone finally understood that the most painful thing for me was never the forced marriage. It was the feeling that my whole life I had to be useful to be worthy of being kept. Ethan opened the small box. This time there's no contract. He looked at me. No family agreements, no one deciding for us. His voice grew deeper. It's just me asking the woman I love if you would be willing to choose me one more time. I started crying before I could even answer. Ethan almost panicked instantly. Don't cry. He moved closer. If you don't want to, I'll just pretend this never happened. I laughed while wiping away my tears. Do you really think that's what's making me cry? I don't know. Ethan sighed. I'm still learning how not to prepare for the worst. I looked at the man in front of me for a long time. Then I nodded. Yes, I said softly. I choose you. The wedding was held 6 weeks later in a small church north of Chicago. No press, no guest list with hundreds of people. No attempt to turn it into a high society event for the wealthy. Just the people who truly mattered. Luis cried even more than I did when he saw Ethan adjusting his tie for the 10th time in the prep room. Margaret adjusted my veil for me herself before the ceremony, her eyes red and teary like a real family member. Daniel baked the wedding cake from his mother's old recipe because Mr. Ethan hates fondant. Everything was very small, very normal. And strangely, it was the first time in my life I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. The moment the church doors opened, I saw my father waiting at the end of the aisle. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked a little more worn than I remembered from his last hospital stay. But the way he looked at me almost made me cry again. He offered me his arm. Are you ready? I nodded. My father gently squeezed my hand before we started walking down the small aisle, which was filled with white flowers and the soft, early spring sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Then, halfway down, he quietly said the words I think I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. You were never the one who should have been sacrificed. I couldn't stop the tears then. Neither could my father. Some apologies come very late. But sometimes, as long as they are sincere, they can still heal a part of you. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle, looking at me with an expression I will probably remember for the rest of my life. No longer guarded, no longer in control. No longer the look of a man always prepared to be left behind. And one man who loved me in the most mature way he knew how. When my father placed my hand in Ethan's, he held it so tightly, not in a possessive way, but in a way that felt like he was cherishing it. The ceremony was so simple, it was almost peaceful. No one was trying to make it a perfect moment, and that's exactly why it felt so real. When the pastor asked Ethan for his final vow, he looked at me for a long time before answering. I promise I will never again make you feel like you have to prove your worth to be loved. I bowed my head and started to cry. Because some people spend their entire youth thinking that love is something that must be earned through sacrifice, through silence, through endurance, through always becoming the easiest person in the room to overlook. until they meet the right person, someone who doesn't make them feel like they have to shrink themselves just to be kept around. Someone who doesn't use love as a reward for good behavior. Someone who doesn't make them pay with their self-respect just to stay. Years later, when I look back on the marriage that started with a cold contract, I still think the thing that changed my life wasn't that Ethan was wealthy or that he had saved my father's company. It was that someone finally saw me as a person worthy of being chosen, even when I no longer had to sacrifice anything. And perhaps that is the rarest form of love. Not the kind that makes you lose yourself to keep someone, but the kind of love that finally makes you feel like you can be yourself and still get to stay. Some people grow up feeling like they are always the last choice. They get used to giving the best parts to others, used to having to try harder to be acknowledged, used to keeping all their feelings inside just so they won't be a burden to anyone. Then, over time, they start to believe that love is something that has to be exchanged for sacrifice. If I'm good enough, they'll stay. If I endure enough, they'll love me. If I'm useful enough, I won't be abandoned. But the truth is, true love never asks a person to lose their self-respect to be kept by their side. It took Claire a very long time to understand that she didn't need to be the easiest one to sacrifice to be worthy of love. And it also took Ethan a very long time to understand that past trauma doesn't give us the right to hurt people who have never done anything wrong to us. Many adults out there are still living with the most wounded version of their inner child. And sometimes, the bravest thing to do isn't to keep enduring. It's learning to stop the cycle of trauma before it's passed on to someone else. If today's story resonates with a part of you, please remember one thing. The right person won't make you constantly worry that you're not good enough. Someone who is sincere won't use love as a test. And true kindness always makes you feel respected before it makes you feel loved. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you also believe that emotional and authentic stories can help us reflect on ourselves, don't forget to subscribe, share this video with someone who might need to hear it today, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, a single story doesn't change someone's entire life in an instant, but it can make one person feel like they are no longer alone.